see everybody out on a Wednesday, rainy evening. Thanks for being here and for your engagement. If you've been to the past two sessions, this will just keep on with our themes related to Pride Month. I'm so excited that Dr. Julia O'Brien is here today for so many reasons. She is the professor of Hebrew Bible at Lancaster Theological Seminary. She is brilliant. She taught a class called Bible, Gender, and Sexuality when I was there, and it was 10 weeks long, a bit longer than our hour tonight, and it was just incredibly healing and helpful and informative for me and for my classmates. And so when we were doing this series, we thought, well, nobody better to bring in besides Dr. O'Brien. So that's really all I'm going to say. Let's welcome her with a round of applause.
So sound is good. Yeah, I can't do anything about the southern accent. Which I actually recognize that sometimes some of the words don't translate as well, so if you don't know what I mean, please ask me, right? I'm really honored to be here, and I'm honored to be part of the work that Grandview is doing. It matters to Lancaster, it matters to the world, it just matters, it matters. So thank you, Grandview, thank you for the work that you're doing. And my hunch is that all of you are here for some reason because you see yourself as part of that work in some ways. So the assignment that I was given, I'm going to confess a little bit, makes me cringe a little bit, right? Because what I was asked to do was to come and talk to you about what are commonly known as the Clobber passages. Most people have heard that term. If you haven't, let's clue you in a little bit. There are a list of 7 passages from the Bible that most frequently get used against LGBTQ and generally queer people. They're treated in a particular way, and they're used as what the Bible says, right? And the way I usually say it, when somebody says it that way, what they mean is, the Bible says it, I believe it, so shut up, right? They're usually used to shut people down, to take the moral high ground for the Bible, right? And in my experience, I've been doing this work for a really long time, what it tends to do is to paralyze. It just paralyzes people who want to be supportive because they don't really know how to do it when somebody's quoting a Bible verse at you. And if you don't know much about the Bible, which, although you're not going to believe this, not many people do. Just because somebody can quote passages from the Bible doesn't mean that they actually know much about it. So if there's one thing that I could do tonight, and that is to say you don't have to give up the Bible to the haters. Right? Even if you're not a Bible scholar, even if you can't dissect every little argument that's being made, it doesn't mean that whatever you're being told is all there is to know. Right? So I study these texts. Again, my specialty is the Old Testament. I also study the New Testament. I've read these texts backwards and forwards and back, and I've read them in Hebrew and Greek. I've read how people have read them over time. I've read them, and I'm going to explain all of this in a few minutes, according to what we think was happening in the ancient world in which they were written. I've read the books, right, in which they appear. And I say all that not to say, oh, look how smart I am, right? But what I'm saying is, what I have learned is none of that will matter. None of that will matter for people who really don't want to engage the conversation. So I need to apologize to you, and you can leave if you want to, because if you came tonight looking for the magic key, that if I could just say this thing about this passage, I could shut everybody else down. I'm sorry, I can't offer you that. Because, as I'm going to explain, what's going on when people use the Bible that way is, on the surface, it looks really simple, but there's a whole complex set of assumptions and beliefs that are going on there. And my goodness, friends, we live in whatever this year, 2022, 23, whatever, 2023. And we know that the debate of throwing things at each other rarely changes people's mind. So I'm addressing you, right, fairly or not, because I haven't met all of you. I'm addressing you as someone who might really be open to hearing alternative ways of understanding these passages. And I'm just going to name, again, what I'm not doing, I'm not going to be able to, like, fix it. I can't fix hatred. I'm sorry. Man, I wish I could. I really wish I could. And that's why when Liz and Andrea reached out to me, I was so happy. And I'm going to use that word happy, that they started the discussion with the Bible last week, not with the Clobber passages, but with affirming ways of reading the Bible. I've taught the class. Liz mentioned gender, sexuality in the Bible multiple times. I just taught it this past spring. And what I find that for most people, it is those affirming ways of reading that are much more life-giving than trying to defend yourself against the blows. So one of the things you'll see that I'm going to do tonight, I'm just going to use images. I've also learned that people hold on to images better than they do to a bunch of words. And so, again, I call it the wisdom of your pastors. I should put plural there. And that is that they wanted you to recognize that all human beings, right, all people can be embraced and accepted and loved, and you start there. I think that's something that Grandview and some other churches are doing really well. They start with the affirmation of human dignity and worth before they get into the debate. And that is a whole different posture than trying to defend yourself from blows. Right? I was playing with the images there. You know, if the Clobber passages are like Thor's hammer, right? You know, you can't really, I can't make it dissolve. I just saw there's a new Marvel movie out. I was listening to that on the way over. Nick Fury's the new hero. But anyway, you know, it's not going to make that a lot. But the minute that somebody starts coming at you with something, there's not going to be an interpretation in the world that can fend that off, right? But again, for people who are open, interested, and what I've actually learned is that there are a lot of people who want to be affirming but don't know how. And they don't know how to reconcile their own, what they've been taught about the Bible, the way they've been taught to read the Bible, and they don't know how to reconcile it with their own experience and the experience of people they love and their desire to be inclusive. So I don't know if I'm going to accomplish that tonight, but I want to start with that. And just truth in advertising, I can't fix these passages. Right. Now, I realize we've got a small screen here, and I didn't know how many of you would be here. You're more than that. So what I did is I have a handout that has some of the slides. And I think you might have to share. That'd be lovely. It's a two-sided person. So I'll talk through them. And what you'll find on this handout is even the handout, these passages are kind of small. But I put them on the back page in a little bit bigger font. I'm sorry. Share. Be friendly. Okay. So these are the usual suspects. Right? You've probably heard some of them. So the first usual suspect is that there's a narrative, a story in Genesis chapter 19 about Sodom and Gomorrah. And in how dare I left out a closed parentheses. Oh my God. That's the kind of detailed person I am. Right, so according to this story, and I'm using the King James Version as my point of reference here, because it's actually not a bad translation for being closer sometimes to what the Hebrew or Greek say. It hasn't been modernized as much as some of the modern translations, and the other reason I'm choosing it is because it's so commonly embraced within conservative Christianity. So, in the King James, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the crime of Sodom and Gomorrah is that the men of the city surround a house and call out for the man who's inside and say, "Bring him out that we may know him." That actually is a Hebrew, in this case, Old Testament Hebrew. It is a Hebrew idiom for have sex with. So it doesn't just mean we'd like to meet you, right? It is an invitation to that. So a mob shows up and asks for sex with a man in a house. So, I'm paraphrasing. So in a setting of gang rape, the threat of gang rape, right? This is a story about how terrible the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were, so that God destroyed them. But that passage is often used against particularly male-male sex because men knowing men. There's two passages from the book of Leviticus, which I know you read every day. Right? The most famous or infamous one is in a list of various regulations that the people of Israel were supposed to follow. And it says, "You shall not lie with a man," this is the King James translation, "as with a woman, because it is an abomination." The next version of that, a couple of chapters later, really just gives you what the penalty is. If you lie as a man, as with a woman, here's all the horrible things that God's going to do to you. Another Old Testament passage, Deuteronomy, according to the King James translation, none of the daughters of Israel should be, I'll say it, whores, right? It intentionally uses the mean, horrible epithet. It's not saying, don't be a lady of the evening. It's saying, don't be that. And that the sons should not be sodomites. That's the translation in the King James. And then, oh, guess what? This is not just an Old Testament issue. There are also passages in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, there are these lists of people who are doing horrible things. And in the list, which the list have a bunch of stuff in them, but thrown in there in the list, according to King James, in Corinthians, there are effeminate, and abusers of themselves with mankind. Now that's gender specific. So men who abuse themselves with other men. And that's a similar passage in 1 Timothy. And then the other more famous one, infamous one, is from Romans chapter 1, where it's explaining why the world is so horrible and how things got to be so bad. And one of the reasons was that men, I've seen how literally you can read, men gave up their natural use of women. Men gave up their natural use of women and burned with lust for one another. We could talk about that one for days. And footnote, we'll get to this. Embedded in all of these texts are certain assumptions about women. not only about same gender loving attraction and relationships, but assumptions about gender hierarchy and what sex is, and we'll get to all of that in a minute. And then one more thrown in there in Jude, again, I know your favorite book, that Sodom and Gomorrah gave themselves over to strange flesh. Now, let's be honest. I'm not going to be able to unpack all of these passages tonight, but actually my challenge is bigger than that. Because in my work in advocacy, I hope you're hearing me as an advocate, in my work in advocacy, I don't even think the biggest battleground is these passages, right? And I'm going to explain that, but then I'll come back to these passages. In my experience, I'll come back to you. I just read horrible things. I had to read what the Bible, those passages said. I said horrible, hurtful things, right? LGBT people know what it means to be called an abomination. Not just what you do to be abomination, but that you are. And I just want to sit for a minute and ask you to take a breath. This is not a place that's going to say those things to you. But that's trauma. Those are traumatic texts. And so one of the things I had to learn over years of teaching, I've been teaching a long time, is that I can't come in and treat these as academic issues. Right? I could tell you all what the words mean and what it means in historical context, and we will do that. But it is also the reality of no matter how anybody talks about them, those words are still in the room. This is one of the things I talk to potential pastors about, is that when you read and I'm using the term of another biblical scholar, when you read a text of terror, right, no matter how you explain it, the words of the terror have already been in the room. So there are ways in which I personally, I don't know what your pastors do, I would never read one of these passages and then explain it. In ways that I would never read a story about a rape or a sexual assault or anything like that from the pulpit and then give a sermon about it. I would talk about it, set it up before, because LGBT people have been traumatized. And that's why I hate talking about these passages, because they're just hurtful. So take a breath. So, I got ahead of myself. Where I think the real, if you want to call this a battleground, or if you want to call it a battle over the Bible, I think the baseline of the battleground is not those passages in and of themselves, but the way people are reading the stories of creation right now. Perhaps you've heard it. This idea that male and female and heterosexual sexual relationship are part of God's intention for humanity is being put or read back less in those Clobber passages than in accounts in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. So you might be more familiar with those. So, King James, male and female, he created them and said, be fruitful and multiply. Chapter 2, Adam and Eve version of the story. And then it says, this is why a man leaves his father and his mother, cleaves to his wife. Right? And the two become one flesh. So those two passages are often understood. Well, see, that's the way God set the world up. And then, oh yeah, let's talk about Jesus, shall we? Right? Jesus actually did say something that Christians need to pay attention to. Perhaps you've heard Jesus didn't say anything about sexuality. Well, you do have to deal with this one, right? In Mark and in Matthew, perhaps you know this, Jesus forbids divorce. According to these books, I didn't write it. Somebody else did. Don't look at me that way. I'm divorced. Right. According to these passages, Jesus said there should be no divorce because in the beginning, God created male and female, and what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. I cheated. I didn't put King James there, but that's where that comes from in marriage ceremonies and that way. So the way the logic goes is something like this. I think of it as like a platform. So in this kind of worldview, Genesis is the baseline. Right? God created people this way. God had this intention for sex. God had this intention. And as I'm going to talk about in a minute, that now has a name in this discourse. It's called creation order. When you hear that term, creation order, it means like that is the way that things are supposed to be: male, female, heterosexual sex. The passages in Mark and Matthew where Jesus forbids divorce and quotes Genesis are understood as confirming what Genesis said. So it's not just the fact that the Old Testament says it, it's that Jesus agreed with it. So Jesus is understood to like hold up what Genesis said was creation order. And then other passages like Leviticus, that should actually say 18. Yeah, boy, details. And Romans are understood as just further examples of see how bad things can be when you go against creation order. Sodom and Gomorrah, I could have put that up there too. Because see, that's why they got punished, because they went against creation order. So this is why, and it's painful to do, but like if you do an internet search, I don't know what AI would do, a Bing AI search would do with this, but back in the day when you do a Google search, when you Google it, all you got to do is put in quotes creation order, and you're going to get exactly these kind of passages, and what you're going to get is the argument, the claim that what the Bible teaches is monogamous, lifelong, heterosexual marriage between one man and one woman. That's how they get it. Now, most folks who kind of have that in your head, and maybe you do too. If you do, you learned it somewhere. That's nothing, no shame in that. You learned it somewhere. It's not always conscious. Like, it's not like people have studied it and come up with that, but once you're looking, as long as you assume monogamous, heterosexual marriage, you can find it. And it all kind of fits together, right? And what I find fascinating is that even for people who don't value science, they'll talk as if creation order is nature or biology. And I want to say, but wait a minute, I thought you didn't believe in biology. Can we talk about COVID? In that way. But anyway, that's actually a quite modern move to say, to somehow blend scientific knowledge about, genes and chromosomes and all of that, and to blend it with Genesis, see creation, nature, natural, and therefore anything that's against that is completely wrong. You can stop me anytime that you want to ask me a question. So, there's three types of moves that people who study biblical passages in the way that I do, which is, like dominant, mainstream, academic way. There's kind of three moves that people use to study any biblical passage, including these. Right? One is to actually read what the texts actually say. It's such a radical to do. Here's one of the O'Brienisms. People couldn't say half of what they say about the Bible if they actually read it. Right. Right. So anyway, sometimes this gets called a close reading. And this is actually one of the most helpful strategies and the most accessible strategies for every human being. You can read these texts for yourself and see what they say and what they don't say. And one of the things that people who study these texts a lot get trained to do is to notice what you assumed was in the text that's not in the text. Like, what assumptions you had to bring to it to make it say the way that you're paraphrasing it. And I'll be honest, that's really hard to do because when we read something we agree with, all of us, we just kind of take it at face value, like, yeah. God is love. Yeah, that's right. That's simple, right? Plain text. No interpretation needed. But then when we read something that maybe goes against what we believe, we're more aware of interpreting. So to actually do this work, to read a text for yourself, is really hard. And that's why I actually think you shouldn't read it by yourself. You should read it with other people, because chances are other people are going to notice things that you assumed that you didn't know you were seeing. Same thing is true around so many things. We tend to read ourselves and our values into the Bible, and we don't notice when we're bringing it in and what we're doing. So you need a tribe. Right? That's why things like this are so important. Right? So, close reading. Second one, a fancy term for it is reading in literary context. And all it means is don't take the passage out of the book in which it's actually in. So, Leviticus isn't just a collection of timeless verses. There are a bunch of verses that have something to do with each other. Same thing with Romans. Paul didn't just write a verse. Paul wrote a letter, a book. And so literary context means you look at like what got said before it, what got said after it, and here's where I'm going to differ than some readers of the Bible. I'm going to think about human authors of the Bible. That doesn't rule out that God had some hand in it. I'm not ruling out God was involved, but I do believe that human authors tend, and I'm assuming they tend to write for the whole thing to make sense. Right? That could be an incorrect assumption, but that's the way I'm going. So I want to know, what do they mean within the larger context of the book? And yeah, some people don't care about this, but I do. All right. What do we know about the time period in which that book was actually written? What do we know about human life? Now, this one's harder to do by yourself. Right? And there's a couple of reasons for it. Without getting too complicated about it, see if this makes sense to you, that just because a biblical book talks about a particular time period doesn't mean that's when it was actually written. I think people who've been in church for a while, or certain kinds of church, maybe know that, have thought about before that, like Jesus didn't write the Gospel of Matthew. Or, like Jesus didn't write, anything that talks about Jesus. Somebody can write about the past from a later time period. So if you want to get really into this kind of work, and I'm happy to share with you resources if you'd like to do that, it's not only a question about what time period is it talking about, but when do biblical scholars think it was actually written? Because maybe the situation is different from the time they talk about to the time that they're writing about. Just like, you could write today, let's say you could write a musical about Alexander Hamilton. And you could do it in rap or, hip hop. You could do that. That doesn't mean that the perspectives of that presentation of Alexander Hamilton were the same at the time of Alexander Hamilton. Now, that gets more complex, but it is work that people do. They try to figure out not only what was going on at the time when this thing was written, and what were some of the assumptions and the values that society had. So if you like sociology, which I do, I like sociology a lot. Sociology is really helpful in reading this way, but it's like ancient sociology. Like, what did that group believe about sex, about gender, about women, about men, about children? So you got that kind of 3 moves. Like, read it yourself, or read it in its own context. Look at the other words that are around it, and then try to see what you can learn about what was going on at the time. So, yeah, 7 passages. Do you see why I couldn't do all that tonight? All right. But you could. All right. So I thought I would zero in and just give you an example of one of them. And just kind of show you how, if you run it through each of those lenses, right, things aren't as simple as people throwing it at you might want you to believe. So I'm going to use Leviticus 18:22, which in the King James says, "Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination." Okay? So let's take strategy 1, or lesson 1. Let's actually read it for a minute. One of the first things to remember is that anytime you're reading something in English, you're reading a translation from another language, of the Bible. Right? In this case, I thought I'd throw in there, yes, this was in February of this year. I'm not picking on this guy, I don't know who he is, but yes, they're in the LPN. It was clear. See, I believe that Christians rely on the Bible. You shall not sleep with a man as one sleeps with a female. It is an abomination. See? Okay. Let's see if George, what we got for you, George. Okay. Okay. So another big concept is that in this case, the book of Leviticus was written in Hebrew. So anytime somebody puts that into English, they could do it in different ways. They could do it in different legitimate. There are different legitimate ways to go between two languages. So what I did next, did I put that on my, yeah, it's on that handout there. I just put some common translations, English translations of Leviticus 18:22. So I don't know, can everybody see that? Either on here or up there. They have the same general idea, but my question to you is, do all of the translations actually say the same thing? You can talk. Do you see one that kind of stands out to you? So this is the New Jerusalem Bible. You shall not have intercourse with a man as you would with a woman is a hateful thing. So, again, not to insult your intelligence, but can we name the things that are in that even weren't in the King James? They said intercourse. Now, I'm not saying that that's not what it meant, but it didn't say that in King James. It said, lie with as with the woman. So that's a little bit different. And that it's hateful. The New Living Translation, how about that one? Do not practice homosexuality, having sex with another man as a woman. It is a detestable sin. There's a lot going on in that translation. There's a lot going on. And again, I'm actually, believe it or not, I'm going to be gracious to translators for a minute. And I'm going to assume that translators don't just change things to make them fit what they want it to say. Might not be true.
There's supposed to be rules about that.
Well, there actually are, but the thing is that the more contemporary a translation is, the more it's going to have to change the words to make sense in the time period that you're reading. So, modern people know, well, this is not true, but the usual assumption is that having sex with another man is homosexuality. Little pop quiz here. Do you know why King James could not have said homosexuality? The word did not exist, right? The word heterosexuality, when it came into the English language before the word homosexuality. Right. So these are really modern kind of words, and if you know anything about psychology, science, you know that it wasn't until Sigmund Freud that you get this concept that human beings have a sexual orientation to start with. This idea that you have an orientation that is a psychosocial, and then that was him, and then later people would talk about a biological component to that, rightly or wrongly. But anyway, this idea that homosexuality is a part of who you are, it is an identity or an orientation, is a really modern concept, like 19th century. Now, that's not to say that ancient people didn't talk about people who did things together, right, sexual things together. It's not that they didn't know about same-sex attraction, but they wouldn't have called it an expression of your orientation, because orientation, that way of thinking, was not available to do that. So the New Living Translation, it has have sex with another man, but then it's kind of explaining to a modern audience what that means, and that's homosexuality. But what if they're not right about that? Right? Because we'll look at the passage itself in Hebrew-ish in a minute, but what if it was forbidding, for modern terms, a heterosexual man from having sex with another man? You can have sex with another man and not be sexually attracted to that. We know about male-male rape, right? That's not necessarily a matter of orientation, attraction. So, I mean, again, that's one of the tricks. People love translations that they can understand and use more modern language, but the risk that you run with that is going to be very, the reason it's understand is going to sound more like your world than maybe it actually was. Does that make sense? So, what should you not do? Now, the whole point that I'm trying to make, people can't agree what that means in Hebrew. Because, literally, it says something like, and with a male, you shall not lie the lyings, or you could translate the same word as lyings, the bed of a woman. Now, what does that mean? What are the linings of a woman? It's a great question. We'll get to sociology in a minute. But, even what it says is not clear. It's like, what are you assuming about what it means to lie with, what are the lines of a woman? That's not clear, and you can read people who study this even more extensively than I do, and they just debate about even how to bring that into English and what are they talking about. And then there's that whole word that word that King James does is abomination. Right. So here's another big concept. Ready? If you really wanted to know what that word means, you can't go look up the English word abomination. Like some of you know about concordances. You go to the back of the Bible and you look up love, marriage. You can't do it that way because the question is, what is the word in Hebrew that the English translators have put into abomination in King James? But we already saw that some people put it into hateful thing, some people did it detestable. So that's where you'd have to have language skills to go look that up. And so one of the ways that you know what words mean is you go look at how they're used in other places. Have you ever read about how the Oxford English Dictionary was created? It's a great book. It's called The Professor and the Madman. I think there was a movie with not Mel Gibson. Was it? It was Mel Gibson. Anyway, that's the way dictionaries get made, is people observe how words are used, and then for the Oxford English Dictionary, they stuck them in cubbies, and then they would gather up all the examples and then try to come up with definitions that explain the different examples. So words only mean what people use them to mean. Like, just think about how words change their meaning because people use them differently, like queer or gay. So I went and looked up the word in Hebrew that gets translated abomination or detestable or hateful is, in Hebrew, it sounds like to'eva. And so I went, did my little concordance search in Hebrew, and here are other things that are called to'eva in the Old Testament. Egyptians consider eating with Israelites as that. And the Egyptians think that shepherds are that. In Deuteronomy, idol worship is that. Deuteronomy 14, non-kosher food is that. And also in Deuteronomy, women wearing men's clothes or men wearing women's clothes is that. I was looking at my pants. Sorry. No. So anyway, so that didn't really help anything. So my point is that not other places that word is used against something aren't always sexual. They aren't always even values that many modern Christians still hold to today. So it just means it's bad. Well, but different cultures think different things are bad for different kinds of reasons. Now, we could keep going on with that a little bit, but here's my big takeaway from Move 1. What sometimes gets called the plain sense reading of Scripture, here's my bold claim: no translation is a plain sense reading. Even if somebody studied Hebrew, in this case, and did it themselves, that's not a plain sense reading, because to make it make sense in your context, you're not just reading the words on page. So the way I would summarize that is that notice that Leviticus 18:22 doesn't necessarily condemn sexual orientation. Doesn't say anything about it unless you're reading the New Living Translation. Doesn't say anything about homosexuality. It does say something about an act, right? But it's not really clear what that act is or why it's bad. I told you I can't make them go away, but what I can do is to say they're more complicated than people treat them. So let's do the next. I made a joke earlier about Leviticus because, let's be honest, most Christians don't spend most of their time making decisions about how to lead their life based on the book of Leviticus. Actually, Leviticus, I stand up for Leviticus more than other people do because it's actually it's got some great stuff in there, but it has this stuff that a lot of Christians, right, I wouldn't say it this way, but other people would say that Jesus came to get us away from. So, for example, it has long instructions about how to offer sacrifices. Animal sacrifices, grain sacrifices, oil sacrifices, what the priest should do, all of that. Talks about how to consecrate priests, and then it has all these laws about things that are proper and improper. In English, they get called clean and unclean. This includes how menstruating women are supposed to be treated. Right? There are regulations on heterosexual sex. Right? A man cannot have sex with his wife while she's having her period. That is, they both get kicked out of the community for that. It has rules about nocturnal emissions. It has rules about what foods you can and cannot eat, kosher food, non-kosher food. And then, as you start getting into the book, then it does have this whole list of things that people are supposed to do to be holy. And the chapter that we're focusing on, the majority of that chapter are rules about incest. You shall not lie with your father's mother. You shall not lie with your sister. There is a whole series of incest rules. And then you get this one. Right? And then that chapter will end by saying, and be different than the Canaanites. Don't be like that. And then it goes on with lots of, there's a passage, love your neighbor as yourself. That's where Jesus got it. Right? But then that's immediately followed, very next verse, with not interbreeding animals, sowing a field with two kinds of seeds, or wearing clothes made with two kinds of material. And don't have sex with a slave. Whatever slaves. Right. It didn't say get rid of free the slaves. It says don't have sex with them because they're owned by somebody else. Now, by lifting up 1822 as eternally binding, that's clearly a selective reading of the book of Leviticus. So it would be fair to ask somebody, if you're going to hold to Leviticus 18:22, why would you not hold to the rest of it, I do think that's where you would run into that passage from the New Testament about Jesus against divorce. I think that's kind of the move about why would you hold on to that one but not the other ones? Well, because in their mind, Jesus supported this idea of male and female. But Leviticus itself doesn't give you any grounds to see that verse is more important than the one about animal sacrifices. Not one. And I'm going to be a literal reader right here. Nowhere in that book does it say that those laws are intended for all people, all times, all places. It says, thus says the Lord to Moses, you shall say this to the Israelites. I can out literal. That's literal. Right? So if you believe that that's eternally universal, okay, make a case for that, but it's not because it's in Leviticus that it is. Right? You have to bring something to it to assume that it has anything to do with you. Oh man, I gotta talk fast. Here's the stuff that I find the most interesting. And then we'll talk about this. What did ancient people believe about sex to start with? Now, how would we know? Right? We can't interview them. You can't do that. So people who do this kind of work, kind of ancient sociology, they do it by reading biblical texts and try to kind of treat it like Jeopardy. Like if these are the answers, what were the questions? You know, they try to figure out like what was the logic that holds them all together. And they also look at other cultures from the same time and see, do they have anything about it that way? And so, I mean, that's pretty fascinating. And in case you have to leave soon, I'll just go ahead and say, ancient people didn't think about sex the way we do. They weren't talking about the same thing we're talking about. Even if some of the acts might have been the same, what those signified in the ancient world was a whole different matter. Even marriage, even heterosexual marriage, was not the same in the time of the Old Testament or even the time of Jesus as it is today. I won't even get into all of this, but like if you've ever gotten married and tried to look for a biblical passage to read at your wedding, it's really tough because there's not any. The closest you can get is that Jesus went to a wedding and brought wine. There's no vows for weddings in the whole Bible, right? There's no ceremonies mentioned. And only in one case is the consent of the woman mentioned. Ancient female-male sex was not considered to require consent on the part of the female. You can read that throughout biblical passages. And if you read lots of biblical passages, you also notice that one of the preferred marriage, or I won't even call it marriage, right? Because there's not vows, there's not consent, there's not promises of loyalty. But these partnerships, one of the most frequent pool of people to draw from are your cousins. That's a little different than the world that I live in. We have reason to believe that most women were given in marriage by the age of 13. And some of these differences are not because, or I'm not understanding, it's because those people were bad and we're great. It is because they lived in a different economic and social system that we did. They were subsistence farmers for whom lots of children was a matter of life and death. Right? And in fact, we know that at least 1 out of 3 children born died before they were 3 years old. people have excavated the graveyards. This is a culture that, like, where people were in compounds and they ate and lived together. I mean, even think about biblical families. Jacob, to get the 12 tribes of Israel, it takes 4 women, 2 of whom are slaves. So, no, it's not just Jacob and Leah, or just Jacob and Rachel. It's Jacob and Leah and Rachel and Bilhah and Zilpah.
Those are just the males. I'm sure they had tons of females interspersed in there too.
We know of at least one. There's the one female mentioned.
Yeah, Dina, the one in there, but she's not a big deal. And the one story we get about her is I would read that as a rape, right? The Red Tent will tell you that she fell in love with him. That novel will tell you she fell in love with him. But the whole story is not about her at all. It's about how her brothers felt dishonored by what happened to their sisters. So one of the things I don't have on here, which is my mistake, one of the biggest things to know is running through all of these texts is the idea that women are inferior and of lesser status, so that their consent doesn't matter. And to cut to the chase, what do you think the lines of a man as with a woman means? You don't shame a man like you shame a woman. In my reading of that, already built into that of why a man's not supposed to have sex with another man is the assumptions that still show up in English today about when somebody does something bad to you, you are effed or est. You know what I mean, right? That idea that even heterosexual act is an act of violence is something that a male does to an inferior status. It kind of runs through a lot of this ancient literature and so why would Sodom and Gomorrah be a horror story? It's not because it's not a same gender loving relationship. It is a gang of males going to rape another male. That's an ancient man's horror, and a lot of men's horror today, right? So this idea that these texts come from a time and a place, and they're not asking the question, what do we think about committed, same gender loving, committed relationships? They're not even asking, is polyamory okay, right? In the context of mutual agreements, because they're not asking questions about mutual agreement. They're asking questions about something else. So, how would you use Leviticus today? I missed it. It must have been funny. Yeah, anyway. So, I mean, just think about that. How do your assumptions about sex and marriage compare with those of the ancient world? So, you got to be honest. You can't use the Bible to support your own stuff either. Right? It's not like some of the passages are different than yours, but like they all are. Like consent, procreation. I mean, by biblical standards, my husband, this was the second marriage for us, and we got married in our 40s. We weren't going to have children anymore. By biblical standards, we should not have got married because we were not going to procreate. We were not, I mean, we both had children and we were going to support them, but biblical mandate, male and female, join, procreate. We missed that one. So, my takeaway is that if we're really going to talk about the Bible and sexuality, we have to be really honest about how we actually read it. And not just how other people are reading it, but how we're reading it. How we're selective. When do we read the Bible? When do we invoke it? Are we trying to win a point by finding a biblical passage too? Right. So I'll just, who's calling me? Oh, it's not. I'll just tell you a story, and then I'll see what you have to say about it. Well, actually, I'm going to two stories. So when my current husband and I were dating, we went out for ice cream with his mother, who's born and bred Lancaster County. This was the time that Hillary Clinton was in the primary against Obama. And she said, I just can't vote for that woman. She supports gay sex. I can't support that woman. And she turned to me, and my husband said, I know, that's why I love her so much. So Kenny, he goes, that's what I'm voting for. Which he didn't, but, he voted for me. Anyway, and then she turned to me, she goes, you study the Bible. Tell him that he can't believe that because of the Bible. I said, Kenny, I love to talk about the Bible. I love to talk about the Bible. Which passage were you thinking of? She said, I don't know. I just know that it's in there. And I said, if you would like, I said, yeah, I love talking. It's like, if you'd like to sit down sometime and talk about the Bible and study that with you, she goes, no, I just want you to tell him he's wrong. So then, just last week, get a phone call. There's a conference coming to Lancaster called Iron Sharpens Iron. Yeah, I didn't know about it. I didn't. So they called me and left me a message at the seminary and said, Dr. Bryan, we would like you to come speak at our conference because we would like you to, your training as a theologian, and we would like to do this. I didn't know anything about it. Called the guy back. What he wanted was a debate about what the Bible says about marriage and sexuality. And he needed me to be the liberal voice.
He had to clobber you.
He did. And I said, I need to respectfully decline. I said, I actually don't support that kind of conversation. I said, it's harmful to people. It's hurtful to people. These are not academic matters. These are people's lives. And I find that approach to dialogue really, really damaging and hurtful. He goes, well, who else could you? Who else could you? And I said, well, the people that I would know and respect take the same kind of standpoint. And so if the group were really interested in having a respectful, open-minded dialogue about what the Bible says about these things, I'd be happy to do it. But this kind of throwing Bible passages against each other, I don't find it constructive. It doesn't change anybody's mind, and it just hurts people. He goes, well, thank you for your time. So all this is to say, right, short version is, I don't think that Clobber passages, like fighting back, like getting your own hammer, it is going to work. But it is true that, let me say it again, that if you really aim to be affirming, you don't have to give up the Bible. There are ways, and there are lots of people you heard about last week, and even people who read the Clobber passages, they don't come to the same conclusions about what they mean for the present. So we could do the same kind of thing with the other Clobber passages. We can even do the creation stories, which, they're not all lovey-dovey either. So there are a lot of ways that we can study these texts if people really want to study. And to do that, not only would other people have to be open to that, but you'd also have to be open to recognizing that maybe you're bringing some of your own assumptions into even those passages about love. The ones we hold on to about, see, Jesus is just about love. Well, maybe we should read some of those passages and literary context too. So if you're going to ask other people to look at their own biases, I think I have to be willing to do mine as well. So for me, and I really will end here, for me, I don't claim that it's the Bible said it and therefore that's what you're going to do. I name my own agency and say, this is the way I'm going to read this passage, here's why, and here's what's important about it to me. And I'm open to hearing other alternatives, but I have to not hide behind the Bible any more than other people do. I mean, I think we need to do a lot better at kind of claiming our own voices, like, I am an advocate, right? And not, here, let me show you that the Bible doesn't really say it. Right? To claim our own voices and our own advocacy. So that was too much already, but it wasn't enough. So I don't know, what do you want to say, disagree about, comment on? It always makes me nervous when I talk about hands, you know.
I can ask a question. A reference that would be a good summary of where somebody has done the kinds of studies you're talking about and has written it in book form.
You know, there are a lot, I'll be honest, I don't necessarily agree with all the ones that are out there. If I may, will you be coming back to other sessions?
Not sure.
You're not sure. Because what I was going to offer to do is to put together a bibliography. I should have done that for tonight and send it to Liz and let her share it with you, if that's right. I mean, there's a little book called Clobber.
Do you have the author?
Like, it's about 50% good.
It's combative, just from its.
Yeah, I mean, really, and again, it's that kind of thing. Say, no, these passages don't say that at all. Everybody's completely wrong. I actually do think a lot of biblical passages do have assumptions in them that are not particularly LGBT friendly, but they're also not friendly toward me as a woman or friendly toward me as a heterosexual partner.
Putting in the historical context, and especially of the author of the book. That's a new idea for me.
Yeah.
That would be very helpful, and if somebody else has done it, it would be really nice.
But the problem is they're often here and there. So let me pull them together and I'll funnel it through Liz. So if you want that, talk to Liz. That'd be great. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing the work. Thank you for supporting the work. And if I can ever, if you think of a question you didn't want to ask here, and you want to follow up with me, you can also email me. Right? I'm sorry, it's such a long email. It's my name, J. O'Brien, Jobrin, and then at, unfortunately, it's Lancaster Seminary. It's too long. .edu. Oh, thank you. Let me support you however I can, right? Or ask questions if you really do have questions and that wasn't what you were looking for. Contact me and I'll see if I can help you find what you are looking for. Okay. So, good
Thank
night.
you.